If you listen closely to the early decades of the 20th century, beneath the marching boots and artillery thunder, you can hear another sound, a quieter, deeper vibration in the machinery of nations. It is the sound of finance straining under the weight of a war unlike any the world had ever seen. By 1914, Europe stood on the edge of catastrophe, its armies polished and confident, its empires gleaming with imperial pride. Yet none of them truly understood that modern warfare would demand not just soldiers and steel, but an economic transformation so immense that it would redraw the architecture of global finance. World War I was the moment when money became a weapon as decisive as any rifle, when treasuries became battlegrounds, and when the fate of nations depended on the ability to mobilize not simply armies, but entire economies. Before the war began, the global financial system rested on a fragile elegance, the gold standard. Currencies were fixed to gold, and gold flowed across borders with the smoothness of water. It was a world that prized discipline, stability, and balanced budgets. But war is allergic to discipline. War devours resources. The instant mobilization orders were signed, the gold standard, centuries in the making, began to tremble. I often imagine the tension inside the central banks of 1914. Officials staring at their ledgers as crowds gathered outside demanding gold, knowing that the monetary order underpinning their world was collapsing in real time. Within weeks, most nations suspended convertibility. The gold standard, that symbol of 19th century confidence, died quietly the moment the cannons roared. Once that anchor dissolved, governments confronted an unprecedented question. How do you pay for a conflict that consumes more money in a single month than earlier wars consumed in entire years? The answer came through three channels: taxation, borrowing, and printing. But the proportions, motivations, and consequences varied dramatically. Germany, eager for a swift victory, embraced the most dangerous path: debt without discipline. Rather than raise taxes, which risked political backlash, the German government funded the war overwhelmingly through borrowing. War bonds were issued with patriotic fervor, plastered across posters, praised in speeches, celebrated as acts of devotion. Every subscription was framed as a blow against the enemy. But below the surface, Germany was mortgaging its future. By avoiding taxation, it kept public morale artificially high and financial stability gravely fragile. When victory failed to materialize and the war dragged on, the system buckled. Money printing began. Inflation crept in like a slow paralysis. The seeds of the hyperinflation of the 1922 were planted not in the armistice, but in the decisions made in those first feverish months. France and Britain chose a more balanced approach: taxes, loans, and international credit. Britain, with its mighty financial infrastructure and global empire, wielded the city of London like a weapon. Sterling remained a currency of trust, even in wartime. British banks tapped into global capital, borrowing heavily from the United States. Taxes rose, new duties were imposed, and yet, even Britain, paragon of fiscal sobriety, could not escape the gravitational pull of war's economic demands. Its budget deficit ballooned. Its gold reserves dwindled. The war pushed Britain from being the world's banker to being one of its largest debtors. France faced an even harsher reality. Much of its industrial heartland lay in the path of German occupation. Factories were seized or destroyed. Coal mines were flooded or captured. To fight, France had to tax more aggressively, borrow more desperately, and rely heavily on allies for supplies. I often picture French finance ministers standing over maps stained with the fingerprints of worry, knowing that each kilometer of invaded territory translated into a deeper financial wound. Yet France, driven by memory of past German invasions, bore the burden with grim determination. It was a wartime economy built on both necessity and vengeance. And then there was the United States, neutral at first, but economically unavoidable. American banks, led by J.P. Morgan & Co., became the financial lifeline of the Allied powers, extending enormous lines of credit long before America fired a single shot. By 1917, when the U.S. entered the war, it had already become the world's primary supplier of weapons, food, and industrial goods. Financing the war transformed America from debtor to creditor nation, one of the most dramatic financial shifts in modern history. When I imagined the New York harbor in 1916, loaded with shipments of munitions and wheat destined for Britain and France, I sensed the turning point. The center of global finance was quietly passing from London to New York. Once officially at war, the U.S. government unleashed a financial mobilization unlike anything in its history. Taxes soared, income tax thresholds expanded, excess profits, taxes targeted corporations benefiting from war. But the true cultural phenomenon was the Liberty Loan campaign. Posters adorned every street corner. Celebrities, businessmen, even Boy Scouts rallied citizens to subscribe. It was financial patriotism elevated to a national ritual. Millions who had never purchased securities bought war bonds, transforming American households into pillars of the war effort. The government not only raised money, it taught the public a new financial literacy. The U.S. Treasury became, in effect, the nation's biggest salesman. Yet financing a war was not merely about raising funds, it was about reorganizing the entire economic machinery. In Germany, rationing tightened, prices were controlled, and the economy shifted into a command structure. In Britain, the government coordinated shipping, coal distribution, and labor allocation. In the United States, the War Industries Board dictated production priorities, turning manufacturers into instruments of national strategy. The battlefield extended into factories, farms, railways, banks. I often think of a factory whistle in 1918 as more than a signal of labor. It was the heartbeat of a nation at war. But beneath the unity and discipline lay profound distortions. Markets that once functioned through price signals now moved according to government decree. Black markets thrived. Inequalities widened. Wartime inflation eroded wages. Savings lost value. The cost of war seeped into every household, every ledger, every loaf of bread. And when the armistice finally came in November 1918, the financial toll was staggering. Nations emerged victorious or defeated, but all emerged indebted, strained, and standing on economic fault lines that would soon shift again. The end of the war did not bring stability. It brought a reckoning. Germany, suffocated by reparations and weakened by wartime loans, spiraled toward collapse. France, victorious yet shattered, faced rebuilding costs that dwarfed imagination. Britain grappled with debt that strained its imperial foundations. And the United States, newly wealthy yet unprepared for its global role, stepped into a century where its financial decisions would ripple across continents. World War I had changed the world not simply by redrawing borders, but by reshaping the financial order beneath them. It marked the death of the gold standard, the rise of government-managed economies, the dominance of American capital, and the realization that modern warfare was as much a contest of balance sheets as battlefields. It was, in every sense, the birth of the 20th century's financial logic, a logic that would soon guide the world into prosperity, crisis, and another global conflict as nations struggled to steady its trembling foundations, to impose order on a system spiraling toward ruin, and to act with the decisiveness that government machinery of the era simply could not muster. And so, as the Panic of 1907 tightened its grip, J.P. Morgan stepped once more into the vacuum of authority, a private citizen assuming the burden of a public institution, a single man becoming, for a brief and turbulent moment, the financial spine of the United States. The crisis began, as so many do, with a flicker of speculation that ignited into a blaze. A failed attempt to corner the stock of United Copper triggered suspicion across Wall Street. Trust companies, lighter regulated, heavily leveraged, began to wobble. The Knickerbocker Trust, one of the largest in New York, found itself at the center of swirling rumors. Depositors lined sidewalks, anxious, restless, pounding at locked doors. Bank runs metastasized from neighborhood whispers into a citywide fever. Markets plunged. Credit vanished. The air grew thick with dread. You could almost feel the pulse of the nation slowing, faltering, wobbling on the edge of cardiac arrest. But Morgan, now 69 years old and physically worn, understood the anatomy of panic better than anyone alive. Panic was not about numbers. It was about psychology, fear, feeding on itself, devouring reason. He knew that restoring confidence required more than liquidity. It required a show of control so absolute that hesitation itself would retreat. And so he summoned New York's bankers, trust company presidents, railroad executives, men accustomed to competing, instead pressing them into an improvised coalition of survival. He locked them in his library on Madison Avenue, a cavernous room glowing with lamplight and heavy with the scent of leather-bound volumes. The message was unspoken but unmistakable. No one would leave until a plan emerged. I imagine that room as an arena of powerful men, pacing, debating, sweating beneath the pressure of imminent collapse. Morgan, broad and immovable in his chair, listened with the patience of a judge and the authority of a monarch. When voices rose, he quelled them. When doubt surfaced, he carved through it with cold clarity. His library became, for several nights, the de facto central bank of the United States. Decisions that would determine the fate of millions were forged between midnight and dawn. First came the rescue of the trust companies. Morgan demanded that stronger institutions backstop the weaker ones, injecting capital to prevent a chain reaction of failures. Some resisted, fearful of contagion. Morgan broke their resistance with the force of moral intimidation, when he fixed his gaze on a reluctant banker and said, "If we don't act, the whole system falls." It was less an argument than a verdict. But the climax arrived when the New York Stock Exchange faced imminent shutdown. Without an infusion of cash, trading would cease, triggering nationwide collapse. Morgan's coalition scrambled to assemble funds, but the sum fell short. As the minutes ticked toward disaster, Morgan isolated key bankers in a side room, locked the door, and refused to release them until they committed the remaining millions. It was coercion, yes, but also salvation. They yielded. The exchange survived. The panic began to loosen its grip, and yet the work was not done. The crisis targeted the city's great institutions one by one. When the iconic trust of Henry Phipps neared failure, Morgan's lieutenants fanned through the night to evaluate its solvency. When calls for liquidity surged the next morning, Morgan personally orchestrated the infusion. He triaged the system the way a battlefield surgeon triages the wounded, coldly, strategically, without apology. Some trusts were saved, others were abandoned. Order required sacrifice. As the panic subsided, newspapers hailed him as a hero, a savior, a man whose iron will had prevented disaster. But Morgan did not celebrate. If anything, he seemed burdened by the very necessity of his intervention. He knew what few yet admitted, that the United States could not rely forever on the instincts of a single financier to stabilize its economy. The machinery of American finance had outgrown the age of personal rescues. Something more durable was needed. And thus, the true legacy of the 1907 rescue was not Morgan's triumph, but its consequence. His actions became the catalyst for national introspection. Congress convened hearings probing the concentration of financial power in private hands. The Peugeot Committee interrogated Morgan himself, forcing him into the public eye he so despised. When asked whether credit depended on money or character, Morgan leaned forward and uttered the line that distilled his entire philosophy. "The first thing is character, because a man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom." Those words echoed across the nation, unsettling yet illuminating. They revealed the uncomfortable truth that America's financial stability had, for decades, rested not on institutions, but on judgment, subjective, personal, opaque. And so, in 1913, spurred by the lessons of the panic and the recognition of systemic vulnerability, the United States created the Federal Reserve, a central bank to do, formally and transparently, what Morgan had done behind closed doors. The age of the single banker bailout was over. Morgan would not live long enough to see the full consequences of his legacy. He died in 1,913 inches Rome, far from the city whose fate he had shaped so profoundly. When news reached the New York Stock Exchange, trading ceased for the day, a gesture reserved for heads of state. Perhaps fittingly, for in the vacuum before the Fed, Morgan had been a kind of monarch, ruling not with a crown, but with credit, leverage, and a will strong enough to calm the storms of capitalism. As I reflect on his life, I see a man both feared and necessary, both controversial and indispensable. He was an institution before institutions existed, a remedy to crises that revealed the structural frailty of American finance. He was not democracy's ideal, nor capitalism's purest expression. But in moments when the nation wavered, He was the force that steadied it. And whether he intended it or not, his interventions reshaped the American financial landscape forever. If this story opened a new lens for you, if Morgan's contradictions, power, and legacy stirred questions, share what struck you most. And if you want more journeys into the minds and moments that shape financial history, follow the channel so you never miss the next chapter in this cinematic tapestry of money and power.